Hi folks, welcome back to our third video in Chapter 10, Evaluating Performance. And here we're going to talk a little bit about linking pay to performance appraisals. So we're going to look first of all at doing it on an individual basis. So if we're evaluating one individual and their contribution to the organization as a whole, we can construct what we call a merit pay grid or a merit pay matrix. And it's a tool for allowing a boss to determine how much of a pay increase each person is going to get, depending on where they fall in their pay range. So now, if we think here back to the quartile, so if you think again back to a previous class where we talked about pay bands, where we have a minimum pay and a maximum pay. If you can think of that as being divided into four pieces, so have a straight line with, say, going from $30,000 a year to $50,000 a year at the top, and then divide that into four pieces, right? So you've got four pieces. The first piece from $30,000 to the end of that first piece could be your first quartile, then your second, then your third, then your fourth, which is your highest. People who are unsatisfactory shouldn't be getting a pay increase, right? That could be the rule your organization says. So say, for example, remember we talked about forced distribution earlier. We said if there's a forced distribution, we could have 10% of our staff has to be determined to be unsatisfactory. That's what we would expect in our organization. If that's the case, you wouldn't be giving increases to those people, right? People who are satisfactory, you can see here, the company might say, well, they may or may not get an increase. If they're in the lowest or the second quartile, so they're not even quite at the midpoint of the range, the pay range, we want to make sure we give those people, because they're performing okay, some kind of incentive to do better. So we might give them an increase. Notice that the closer you come to the midpoint, the lesser an increase you get, because companies don't want people to get too far beyond the midpoint, or else they may eventually get to a part in the pay range where they get paid too high. So you can see here that people who are lower might be people who have been with us for only a short period of time or a shorter period of time. We want to give them more incentive to get better, so maybe they're getting a 4% increase. But somebody who's at the third or the fourth quartile, probably somebody who's in that area of the pay range, was probably hired in pretty high because we deemed them to be very good at what they did when they came in to our organization, and we had to pay them higher, or they've already got there. They've already been with us for a while. They know the ropes. That's how they got their pay increases, to get as high as they are in the range. If they're only performing at a satisfactory level, I gotta think we'd be wanting more from them, wouldn't you? Just to be satisfactory. So maybe pull up your socks and do a lot better than satisfactory. Get into good. Because if you're good when you're in the third or fourth quartile, we actually knew you had talent when we brought you in. You've proved to us you did, because you're at the third or fourth quartile of your range. You're being paid well. And you know what? You're performing pretty good. So we're going to give you a pay increase. And again, if you're in the lower end of the range and you're performing very well, we also want to give you some incentive. So we'll give you a little bit more, because we want to make sure you get closer to the midpoint of the range, which is where an average person should be, right? And then what if you're excellent? Well, if you're excellent, of course, and if you're in the higher end of the range, we should give you a good pay increase. But some companies might say, well, people who are lower who are doing excellent, they haven't even been here as long. Gee, that's fabulous. They're doing so well. We want to give them a little bit more, because we want to bring them closer to the midpoint or just over the midpoint of the range to make sure that they're in balance with people who are performing at their level. So sometimes companies might set up a grid like this. Now, this is just an example of the percentages that could be in there, but I'm trying to explain to you a little bit of what the thinking might be when we put this grid together. So people who are at the lower ends of their range would probably get a bigger increase than people at higher ends of their range, because they have a little bit more to prove to us, and they're doing it. They're doing well. So we want to get them to that midpoint of the range and even over, right? So that they can be getting more than just a decent pay. And of course, if they're working out well for us, we want to retain them, right? So part of the retention strategy might be to give them a bigger increase. Now, let's say we've got people in teams. We can come up with an individual or a team merit grid, very similar to what we did with the individual, but now we're going to look at your contribution to the team, okay? And do we consider it to be unsatisfactory, effective, high, or exceptional, given, how the team did? So how did your contribution, your individual contribution, contribute to the team goal? So let's say, for example, your team didn't meet its goal, and you are unsatisfactory in your performance. You're not getting anything. If you're unsatisfactory and the team exceeded their goals, guess what? That's not very good. You're not going to get anything because you didn't do very much to help them, right? What if the team exceeded their goals, right? And your performance was considered to be, by your members, your team members, to be effective? Then you're going to get an 8% pay increase, right? Because the team did well and you did a lot to contribute to that. If you did a lot to contribute to it, but the team didn't do too well, you're not getting as big a pay increase. So you can see in this scheme, it's to your benefit to put your best foot forward every day and to do what you can to make the team successful. Because the more successful the team is, and the better you are, if the team meets their goals or exceeds, that's when you're getting a pay increase. And a bigger pay increase if the team exceeds and you perform well, right? So the idea is that you want to make sure that you are not only putting your best foot forward, but everybody else in the team is too, because only with that will the team exceed their goals. Let's say your contribution's high and the team exceeds, you're going to get 12%. But if you give fabulous performance and the team just meets their goals, not everybody else did as well as you clearly, but you're only getting 6%. So in this way, your individual performance is tied to what the team does. So you not only have to do well, but your team has to succeed for you to get a higher increase. And that's the way it is in a team system. Now, if we want to look at designing effective merit systems, what are some things that the HR department has to think about? Well, what should be the objectives of the system? We talked earlier on about some of the objectives of performance appraisal, the administrative, developmental, supervisory, and symbolic. I would think we'd want it all to be part of, the objectives of our system. But there might be some people where we might want to reward more for developing, developmental, if they've grown with us, and if they've shown promise, not just an administrative process, and not just an exercise for supervisors to get better at delivering tough messages to people, right? And delivering good news as well, right? So the idea here is, what do we want the objectives of the system to be, the merit system to be? Because we'll craft it like that. We'll train people in it. What is it that we want this system to do for us? And what would be the most appropriate measurement system? So how are we going to measure performance? Graphic rating scale, behavioral observation scale, how do we want to do it? How frequently should we conduct appraisals? Well, I always say you can't do it frequently enough. Most supervisors don't do it because they don't have time to do it frequently, especially if they have a large staff or a large span of control, right? So that can be difficult to have the formal sit down. I often say this to people. You know what? You'll find you'll have to have a formal sit down a lot less if, when you catch people doing things right, you say, hey, good job, this is what was great about what you did. And if you catch them doing things that they should be doing differently or better, stop them when you see them doing it. And tell them and teach them. Make that a coachable moment, a teaching moment for them. How are appraisals linked to pay? Well, we saw a couple of examples in an individual and in a team setting. We just looked at those grids. How are you going to link them to pay? How big a pay increase are you going to get? How appraisals are linked to pay. Don't forget, we kind of work backwards here. How much of our operating budget are we going to spend giving pay increases this year, whether it's bonus, merit, pay, whatever it is you're going to give, right? So kind of a little bit of a work backwards system. Because, these percentages that we're building in here are based on your budget, right? These are all based on your budget. How much can you afford to pay? So you have to have an idea of what you think your people are going to be. Do we think 70% of our people are going to be good? 20% of them are going to be excellent? 10% are going to be satisfactory? And we're not going to have any unsatisfactory because we're going to hoof them before they become unsatisfactory again. Do you know what I mean? So it depends on what your organization is thinking. What percentage of people do we have? What percentage do we think that are being paid at the fourth quartile now, or the third? And, let's look at those average pays in each of those quartiles and get an idea of what it's going to cost us. Then we can decide if we need to lower or increase any of these percentages. So sometimes we have to have an idea of how much we want to allocate to salary increases. How should feedback be provided? Okay, you have to think about that. How are we going to provide it? Is it going to be a sit down? Is it going to be frequently on a daily basis, weekly basis? How are we going to do that? How is procedural justice to be achieved. Don't forget procedural justice we talked about quite some time ago. It's the perception that the performance appraisal process is fair. So in other words, the process that I just went through with my boss when I appraised my performance and I look at what I got, did I think he or she conducted a fair appraisal? And did I get what I expected as a result of the assessment that we agreed to? So again, it's important that people perceive the process of performance appraisal to be fair and just. Only then will they be able to accept the reward they got or the reward they didn't get. So being honest with people is very important. I just want to talk a little bit about procedural justice and feedback again, because I think one of the things that's important to notice here is that when you have your formal sit down with your employees, whether it's at the end of 6 months or 3 months or a year, they should be getting little tidbits of information throughout the period before the formal sit down to give them feedback to know how well they've been doing. So if you catch them doing things right, if you catch them doing things that you don't think are appropriate, if you catch them or if the data comes out, say they're being performance managed based on data, coming out from computer systems, make sure they have access to that data, because they can self-manage. They can see themselves, man, I didn't hit my targets or my goals, Well, if you know you didn't hit your targets or your goals, guess what? Your boss knows too, right? So So sometimes that's an opportunity when we have the metrics to sit down with people informally before the formal sit down and say, okay, what needs to change here? What do we need to do differently or better so that you're back on track and you meet your goals and objectives? So, we talk about feedback being provided informally, but it can be provided based on actual results from a system that's monitoring performance as well. How do you train the raters? So how are raters going to be trained and evaluated? How do we know our raters are doing a good job? Well, a lot of times organizations have their employees do surveys and rate their boss. We do them at work once a year. I know for sure. So, I've got to think other organizations do it as well. So how are raters being trained and evaluated to make sure that they're doing a good job of giving people feedback on their performance? And that could be something in the survey that the employees have. How well do you think, or how often does your boss provide you feedback? Do you think the feedback is appropriate? Do you think the feedback is well communicated? Do you think the feedback is specific? These can be survey items that employee answer surveys on their boss, right? So that's how they can be evaluated and trained. HR is supposed to do this. HR is supposed to make sure that when the forms come out for evaluation, that people are trained, they know how to deal with some of those sticky or difficult situations. So HR has a huge role to play in item number 7 here. And how is the system to be evaluated? How are we going to know whether or not our merit system is actually working well and it's motivating for people, it's working well for managers who are assessing performance? We can ask them, right? We can survey them. We can talk to people. Doesn't all have to be done by survey. But again, you need to get feedback from your employees on how well the system is working to deliver candid, accurate, and good results. That people can say, you know what, the system worked or it didn't. This is what I didn't know about, didn't learn from the system. I didn't learn about my performance that I would have liked to have known. So, we need to know whether or not the feedback mechanisms and our approach to giving the feedback is working. So, now, the last thing you should be doing here is making sure that you know what's due this week, what's due next week, and make sure that you craft a plan. If you've got group work due, discussion boards due, make sure you craft a plan. Take some time to participate in your boards. And if you haven't been participating to the fullest extent you'd like to, this is an opportunity to make sure that you do. So make sure you know what's coming up. Stay on top of things. We're getting close to the end of the course now. Make sure that you're thinking about reviewing, maybe doing some multiple choice practice. Make sure you go into your gradebook as well, and make sure you know how well you're doing. Get an idea of what you're going to need. If your goal was to achieve an A in the course, what kind of marks do you need in the exam and any upcoming quizzes to get an A in the course, right? So make sure you have an idea of where you stand in the course if you don't already have it. And again, as always, have a great week. Enjoy yourselves. Just relax. Enjoy the course. Enjoy working with your classmates, and have an excellent day.